So good. I think I'll get started right here. So again, for those who just joined, my name is Marc-Olivier, and thank you very much for joining for this webinar, actually a taster lecture. So I'll talk about not just my passion in nature-inspired chemical engineering, but also about how this relates to our research, which we carry out at UCL. And of course, I'm teaching on the subject for fourth year students and MSc students. But before I start talking about this, I just want to congratulate our offer holders, undergraduate and master students, and welcome everybody who joined for my webinar today. And I'll share you something about nature-inspired chemical engineering, trying to explain what that is. And as the subtitle tells you, this is an approach, a nice approach to solve some of our very challenging problems. A lot of the problems we have related to sustainability, scalability, efficiency, robustness, and so forth, which chemical engineers need to solve, are very difficult. And but we also, I will show, we can learn a lot of lessons from nature to help us address these issues. We work on this within not just the department, but also in collaboration with many other departments at UCL. And that's very typical for the school, where we have very broad collaborations across departments, faculties. So there are people involved in the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering, which I set up a couple of years ago, all the way from architecture to medicine. So why do we work on this? Well, there are many challenges, as I already said, and they can be framed in a variety of ways. In the midst of this current challenge of COVID-19, let us not forget that there are another number of challenges related to sustainability, although health is, of course, of primal importance. And other ones defined by the UN Sustainable Development Goals related to poverty, to hunger, to well-being, education, also a lot to energy. And we can also phrase our challenges in different ways. For example, in the UK, there's industrial strategy, defines our challenges in terms of clean growth, or the future of mobility, and an aging society. Now, grand challenges, again, we can define them in many ways, but in the end of the day, the problems are really clear. I mean, oftentimes they revolve, technically speaking, around energy, around water, around sustainability. But the question is more of how do we solve them? And the various academies of engineering, both here in the US and China, have been thinking about this and offering a variety of ways. And last year, there was a Global Grand Challenges Summit that was held in London, where they reassembled. Now, the point is every time that we get back to the same issues, I mean, think about climate change, for example, think about health crises. And the thing is that they are very, very big problems, obviously, and they need to be solved by thinking out of the box, not in conventional ways. The way we need to address them, we need to collaborate between people to implement this. After all, they are really grand challenges. We need to think differently. Also understanding the context to be effective. Now, something that might work in one country may not work somewhere else. And also the technical content is one thing, but we also need to think about legislation, the environmental context, social issues, and so forth. Now, innovation needs to be done in a responsible way as well, but we also need to be able to balance that with taking risks. Now, as I said, these challenges are big, they're grand challenges. So oftentimes the industry works through a lot of incremental changes, so small changes. And this can work, can create some benefits, but to actually make very significant changes to address bigger issues, these challenges need to be addressed through transformative ways. And at UCL, we recognize this. So we have a variety, we have 6 grand challenges. And as of 2016, one of these is on transformative technology and grew, in fact, to a large extent out of the idea of nature-inspired engineering. And it tries to see how we can innovate by working across disciplines for reaching better benefits for society and the planet. And this is between engineers and also social scientists and so forth. So again, typical for UCL to really think out of the box. Now, as a chemical engineer, I'm always amused by this image when we think about a modern chemical plant, looking at the right, and then we look at this picture on the left, which is actually from a book from the 16th century on metallurgy. Now, in both of these images, you see tanks in series and with blenders and mixers to produce products. Now, the question you can ask yourself is, what is really fundamentally new here? Have we learned anything? Sure, they're not made out of wood, perhaps now, and we may need sophisticated computational tools to help design them, but really, it has our thinking changed. And this goes back to what I was just talking about the need for transformative changes. So can we innovate lessons by drawing lessons from nature is what I'm asking, and I'm going to try to show you now today of how this leads to this methodology on and learning from nature in what I call nature-inspired chemical engineering. And when we look at nature around us, the architecture and the dynamics of nature has many things to be learned from. There are a lot of associated desirable properties. One is that there is a scalable architecture which stretches from molecules to cells to organs and entire organisms, where things are intertwined in a very effective way so that you have optimized transport from the molecular scale to the macroscopic scale of organisms. And this goes together with chemical reaction processes at the molecular scale. So you have an intensification of processes.
Sorry, Marc-Olivier.
Yes?
Sorry, can you share your screen, please?
Can I share my screen?
Your presentation.
Oh, goodness, I did not know it was not shared. Can you see this now?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Apologies for this. I mean, I'm really new to this, so I had not realized. So I will very quickly show perhaps the previous picture. So what I was saying is that we have a number of challenging problems to solve. I went over this already, that we need some transformative changes. Now, the image I was alluding to was the picture here on the right of a modern chemical plant, and one from the 16th century, but that they have a lot of features that are very similar in reality. So there's nothing really fundamentally new in what we see here. And the questions we're going to try to address today is, can we innovate by drawing lessons from nature? So when we look at nature, we see an architecture and dynamics at multiple scales, linked from the way that DNA is folded within the nucleus of the cell to the structure of leaves, for example, trees, entire organisms. And so we have optimized transport across these length scales with reaction processes at the molecular scale, and this leads to an intensification of processes, a very effective scaling across these different length scales. Now, another thing we see in nature is that many processes do not happen at equilibrium. They occur very far from equilibrium. So collective dynamics are key. So this is not something where everything is at thermodynamic equilibrium, which is equivalent to death. Things occur very far from equilibrium. For example, we breathe in and out, our blood is pulsing through our veins, and our neurons are firing to think. So think about it, a lot of essentials to life are related to processes far from equilibrium. And this leads to adaptability as well, resilience and robustness. For example, the way that bacterial communities can survive on a petri dish, when there is insufficient food, they avoid each other and they generate different types of architectures. And this leads the whole community to be more resilient. On the other hand, learning from this and knowing how this happens, we can also break that as well for antibacterials. And so clearly, when we look at life, we see these typical key properties we need to achieve of optimization of transport, of efficiency, effectiveness, resilience. And those are very similar to desirable properties we have in engineering and chemical engineering in particular. So this is a picture which was together with the invite, which was inspiration I got from, say, my garden. So this is a picture I took last week. And I wanted to show you some of the devices that, that can be drawn as inspiration from these trees and these hierarchical structures from the molecular to the macroscopic scale. And I'll get back to each of these in my talk now. So really, what is NISE, or nature-inspired chemical engineering? It's learning from the architecture and the dynamics of natural systems at all scales to help us design and synthesize innovative, superior solutions to technological challenges. And these are related to resource efficiency, to energy, water, materials, therapeutics, living environments, and systems. But what's very important when learning lessons from nature is that we need to think about a fundamental mechanistic understanding and not imitate out of context. Because if we just directly imitate nature, nature may have different purposes than we would have. And the context in a practical application may be very different from the one in nature. And I'll just illustrate this here in a minute. So think, for example, about a tree. A tree, again, it's a chemical reactor. So a tree is very beautiful. We see this hierarchical structure, but each of these scales is important. What's happening at the nanoscale is important for photosynthesis, the conversion of the carbon dioxide and into the biomass that makes the tree grow and oxygen thanks to sunlight. But that's only possible thanks to the structure of the leaves, where water and nutrients can go to the photosynthetic complexes, products can move out, and the structure of the tree crown itself, which links the stem to each of these twigs. Now, and the tree also grows in a way that is so-called fractal or self-similar. So it grows in a way that the number of branching levels grows from a young tree to an older tree, while the size of the twigs is the same in the young and in the old tree. So it's just the number of generations that is different. And this is very different from the conventional type of reactor engineering, even though there is a similarity here. The nanoscale corresponds to active sites in catalysis, where molecules get together on the catalyst to generate products. The mesoscale is like a catalyst particle with its porous sponge, a pore network, where molecules move in and out, the products move out, reactants move in, and then you have the reactor scale, which is the tree. But it's clearly very different from that image I showed you of the chemical plants. Now, thinking about trees, I mean, both architects and artists have been, of course, been inspired by trees over the years. I mean, this is an example of Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, but this is more biosimilarity. It's just copying nature directly, right? So it is not using principles from nature. Yes, you can grow these orchids and beautiful plants, but this would not work in another context, right? You need tropical environment for these plants to grow. Now, another example is the one of the Sacred Family Church, Sagrada Familia in Barcelona of Gaudí. And here the architect Gaudí, 100 years ago, he was inspired also by the structure of trees, but more by the way that these branches, you have a mechanical balancing of forces so that these branches can carry a very tall crown of the tree. And this idea was used to construct columns to support the dome of this very large cathedral. And so you can see how this branching architecture allows for balancing of forces to be able to carry the dome. And so this is an example of learning from nature, being inspired by it, but not directly copying it. Similar hierarchical structures you see in bones and in tendons. Again, structures are important from the molecular scale all the way to the scale of the full bone or of the tendon. And there's a combination of properties here. These are multifunctional. It's for mechanical strength, it's the efficient use of materials, tendons needs to be flexible, and so forth. So an example and point is the Eiffel Tower. Gustav Eiffel was inspired by the structure of the bone. He didn't copy the structure of the bone directly. He didn't copy a bone. He didn't build giant bone. But what he did is he used the principle of the balancing of forces you had in our biggest bone, which is the thigh bone, in order to carry our bodies around. That bone needs to be strong, but it also needs to be light. And the cells in the bone need to be able to survive. So it's porous. And the way this achieves this big strength and all these properties is by having this hierarchical structure. And so in this way, you could build a tower that will tall tower out of a minimum amount of iron materials, using a different material, clearly, not the biological material. He used iron and built this giant tower, but with a minimum of material. So you see this ingenuity of engineering in here. And this is again not biomimicry or biosimilarity, imitation, but it is learning from mechanistic principle. And it is this that is key also to the approach we're going to utilize in chemical engineering called nature-inspired chemical engineering. So it's learning from this at all scales to help solve technological challenges. And again, thinking about mechanisms and not imitate out of context. But still, I haven't told you how we can actually achieve this, right? We need a methodology, because otherwise we just need some blind inspiration. I mean, we can, well, not necessarily blind, we can look around and maybe we feel inspired and we can use some ideas from nature. But what we've actually developed at UCL and in the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering and the Department for Chemical Engineering is this nature-inspired solutions for engineering methodology, a very systematic method to learn lessons from nature to solve problems. And so to just kind of illustrate how we can learn from nature, there are two specific ways, I would say, in science where you can learn principles from nature. One is the more biological ways. It's looking at an organism like this tardigrade, which is a macroscopic organism that can live at the bottom of the sea and top of mountains. It could even survive in space for a long time. That's how robust it is. It is exceptional, it's rare, it's concrete, it has these special properties that leads to not being dehydrated. So biologists actually focus on the specifics and on the uniqueness. And that's a very powerful way of looking at nature and learning from nature. But then there's another way, which is more the eyes of physics. And physics looks more at universal features. Think about the laws of gravity or electromagnetism. These are universal laws. So here we look, for example, at patterns. We see patterns on dunes, on beaches, or these altocumulus clouds, and we know that they are similar. And so there's a similar physics behind this. There's some commonality. And so this requires not just looking at the concrete, but to abstract and to say these are patterns. What are the physics? What are the equations behind this? And how can we understand that? And so one example of such patterns I've illustrated with a tree is an example of fractal structures. And this was discovered by Benoit Mandelbrot, who was actually my mentor. I worked also with him when he was at Yale. And he wrote this famous book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And he discovered that there's an underlying self-similar and fractal symmetry to various organisms and structures in nature. Look at the lung, look at its vascular network, look at the tree. They look similar at multiple scales. They link the micro and the macro scale in a very efficient, symmetrical way. Right? This is some picture actually of some vegetables that are all fractal in my kitchen. And you see this, also this self-similarity you see in the broccolini and the cauliflower and the Romanesque. And so the methodology we are applying in nature-inspired chemical engineering needs to be something that is actually practical because we want to solve real problems. We are engineers and enabling. But the way we do this is in a thematic way, you're looking at universal principles. And these are related then to the themes within the CNIE, the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering. So they look at these mechanisms that underpinning the relation between principles and applications. So what are these mechanisms? Well, these are fundamental mechanisms like the hierarchical transport networks. That's the first one already mentioned. There's a second one, which is balancing of forces. I mentioned in a mechanical sense when talking about bones and tendons and the applications of that, but also at the nanoscale on molecular levels. You have electrostatic forces, you have nano-confinement effects. These help, for example, proteins to fold in so-called chaperones, or they help water to be channeled through cell membranes, but ions don't. And this is a very subtle balancing of forces that's going on there. And then you have, as I said, nature, a lot of processes occur far from equilibrium. And you have self-organization through the dynamics. There's a dimension of time, right? To gusts of wind, or through the waves, you get pattern formation on these sandy beaches. And bacterial communities can self-organize to be more resilient. So what can we learn from these dynamics? And then the fourth theme, we are just starting to explore. These were the three themes that we have explored over the years, thanks to support by the EPSRC with a Frontier Engineering Award we won in 2013, following the Grand Challenges meeting that was held also in London at that time. And then very recently, as of last year, we are expanding now with a fourth theme, learning from ecosystems and networks and the modularity that you see, for example, from rainforest to perhaps we'll have time for looking at rain diagnosis and how they function to absorb water and to retain water, or genetic networks. So the methodology can then be expanded by doing this systematically. So we don't just look at mechanisms, but we want to solve a particular problem, an application in certain contexts, like a chemical reactor. We want to scale up or build a new fuel cell or a new catalyst, and we learn lessons from nature, right? But we don't do this in a direct way. We follow this arrow where we derive a particular concept, such as the fractality, the fractal structure of a tree or of a lung. We learn from that concept to implement a particular design that then we use in a prototype to solve a particular real problem in engineering. So this is a very methodological approach. And by doing this for a number of examples, by learning then and working through this, we can contextualize. So we can actually use this approach also to solve some other problems. So not necessarily in one field, but then translate to another one. So in this way, it's a pathway to innovation, right? And it becomes not so much ad hoc, not so much that you solve just one problem and then you wonder, how do I solve now another one? So once you solve it in a particular way for, say, a chemical reactor, for maybe you can use the same approach to solve a problem in dentistry. When you apply a problem in catalysis, maybe you can apply it then to redesign a new a fuel cell, for example, or a material for delivery of drugs. So this is a very versatile approach. And in the course on nature-inspired chemical engineering that I've been teaching for the last 5 years at UCL, and the last year also with a new lecturer, Dr. Yang Lan, we practice this approach. I mean, there are a number of lectures on this, but also the students, you work in themes. You work in teams of say 4 students, 4 or 5 students together to explore and solve a particular problem of your choice using this particular approach, right? And so, presenting it, learning also from things we do in the laboratories, reading literature, and going, and it's always fun for me to see at the end of the term the projects, how they are presented. And they are presented even not just in an oral presentation for the entire class, but also in a report that reflects a grant application. So to say, if we can work this out, what will we do in the next 3 years? Okay, so I'll just show you just a few examples of how we can apply this approach. And I'll focus here on hierarchical transport networks. We may not have time to go over other examples. As I said, this is a taster lecture. We just have a taste of things to come. So already we talked about reactors, right? So chemical reactors, they are used to convert reactants into products. But we want usually a particular product distribution, a number of products, right? And this is through reaction networks governed by the kinetics. But there's a very big range of scales between the scale where the reactions happen at the nanoscale, so scale of nanometers, to the scale of typical reactors, which may be meters in size. So 9 orders of magnitude in this case. And these reactors may be filled by catalytic particles where the molecules are converted from reactants to products. And so the issue which you have is that when you apply chemistry and you do things at a small scale in the lab, things are not going to be the same at a very large scale in a plant, because you may have maldistribution, you may not have effective distribution of fluids. So you have transport issues and maldistribution. So let's just focus on one type of reactor, so-called fluidized bed reactor. And I'll show how we can learn from this tree as a chemical reactor to actually solve some of these problems around maldistribution and getting a much better controlled product distribution. So let's first look at this macro scale, the scale of the reactor, and perhaps we can learn some lessons from trees here. Well, a fluidized bed reactor is a very complex type of dynamic system. So it is a reactor in which gases are distributed to a bottom plate, typically, in a reactor that's filled with solid particles. And when the gas flow is high enough, then these particles are set in motion. And you can see this in this video here. So you see these gas bubbles that are emerging, but what you also see is that they grow, they coalesce, they're unequal in size. And if you want to scale this up to a large reactor, these bubbles become bigger, the high dynamics are difficult to predict. So there's a big challenge here. And a lot of the design still today is very empirical, even though modeling approaches have advanced so much. Another issue is that when you use small particles as used in pharmaceutics, for example, or these reactors, they are used to dry particles, for example. When you have a gas, a warmer gas going through this bed of particles to dry them or to coat them. So it's used in a lot of processes. Then you can get caking and you get maldistribution, all right? So this is a big issue. So the design, as I said, is highly empirical still. Maybe we can draw some lessons from nature, the structure of lungs and of trees. And indeed, one of the first inventions in this regard was a fractal injector. So I invented this type of fluid distribution device, which is now not just from the bottom of the reactor, but inside the reactor. So you have sufficient gas, primary gas going from the bottom to distribute the gas, but then you also have secondary gas through an injection device that has this fractal self-similar structure and is embedded in the bed. And you see the schematic on the left, and then a prototype here in the middle. This is a photograph of one built out of steel. And so if you want to scale now up from small to large scale, what you do is you don't just preserve the structure itself and just make every tube bigger, but you just change a number of branching generations in this tree. And what you may notice here is that the distance from the inlet, from the stem of this tree to each of these outlets is identical. This is similar to the tree. This is similar to the structure in the lung. So in this way, you get very uniform outflow of the gas mixing locally with the particles. And if you want to scale this up and you just change the number of generations, but you keep the last size of these twigs the same, then you again have the same outlet velocities and you have again uniform distribution. This means you can study this at a small scale in a small vessel and then immediately translate this and scale this up to a large vessel. So it solves a whole range of problems similar to how the lung and the tree function to scale the small to the large and function in a similar way. So the way this works is that when you look in this fluidized bed without fractal injector, you see these larger bubbles, but when you use the fractal injector, these bubbles almost disappear. Even though the total amount of gas is the same, the gas mixes very effectively locally now with particles. So you have very good transfer of molecules from one to the other. You can also have good heat transfer, actually. And so in this way, you can operate this system much more uniformly. And you see a fractal injector shown on the right here with this fractal structure built. Right? And so when you apply this then to a process such as the production of maleic anhydride, you see the structure of this molecule here on the right. This is through the oxidation of butane in a catalytic process. Well, the more gas that goes through the fractal structure rather than through the bottom of the reactor, the higher the overall conversion, the higher the yield of the product. Now, if you have butane with oxygen or with air, right, and oxygen out of the air, then, as you well know, of course, the butane could also oxidize without the catalyst and directly make CO2, carbon dioxide. And that's not what you want to make. You want to make your product for both economic and environmental reasons. So in what you also see here is that the selectivity towards the product you are making is also increasing. And this is because you have much better local control. The gas directly mixes with these solid particles there where it needs to be, and it preserves this across scales. And you also have local fresh feed at multiple levels throughout the reactor rather than only through the bottom. So what I've actually guided you through now is to look at this natural model, the structure of the tree or of a lung, then use abstract, right? Abstract the concept, which is this fractal structure that links the macro and the micro scale, and also preserves this from a small to a large scale by just changing number of generations, going from a large, if you were to go from a small lung to a large lung, or from a small reactor to a large reactor. And then through, with the help of computation, with the help of experimentation at small scale, to come up with this design, which you can then build, right? This is through pipes that are put together and then experimentally realize with the results I've just demonstrated. So you see, we didn't just say, let's look at trees and lungs and let's immediately come up with some solution that's interesting, how that works. You need to go in an engineering fashion. This is typical for process design in engineering. And also the courses we teach in chemical engineering is typical is go to chemical process design is a course in the 3rd year, right? And there's advanced process design as well. And this works along this methodology where you go in a systematic way from your source of inspiration to final results, okay? And so very recently, we have implemented this also with colleagues in Zhejiang University in China for liquid-liquid mixing. So as I told you at the beginning, what is interesting to this approach is that you can translate to new problems. So also when you want to mix liquids, you can use a similar approach. But what you may also notice is the picture on the left is that this is now done not just by putting pipes together. The picture I showed you before was 10 years ago. Now we can do this by additive manufacturing, by 3D printing. Indeed, the techniques have evolved, and this makes it possible to structures that may initially have looked complicated, too complex to make. And at that moment, when I just invented actually the fractal injector, it was perhaps too early to immediately implement because the structure seems too difficult to make. It's too expensive perhaps. But now to 3D printing, you can much more easily build these and implement this. And this opens a lot of possible opportunities. right? So let's now look at this intermediate scale, the mesoscale. As you know, the structure of leaves is not the same as the structure of the tree crown itself. The architecture of leaves is quite different, but it also serves to distribute the fluids. Now, the way in which it does it is quite different. It does it through capillary flow and also through diffusion. Diffusion is the random motion of molecules. So at a very small scale, when channels are very narrow, then the pressure drop would be too high if this were purely through flow, pressure-driven flow. And so it's the random motion of molecules that takes over, and that's called diffusion. And what we notice in nature is that the structures at the macro scale and mesoscale are quite different when you have a transition from flow to diffusion. Now, this is important when we want to design new porous catalysts, right? I mentioned these catalysts before. Think about in the tailpipe of a car. This is an example of a porous catalyst that's located there to remove the pollutants and to convert them into CO2, nitrogen oxide, and nitrogen from nitrogen oxides and remaining hydrocarbons, right? So this is a porous catalyst in a monolith. And in these catalysts, unfortunately, often because the channels are so narrow. So why are the channels so narrow? These pores are so small in these porous catalysts. Well, they are small to have a very high surface area, right? So you can cram hundreds of square meters per gram of catalyst in a porous catalyst. Is enormous, enormous surface areas. But you pay a price for this. The pores are very narrow. They are so-called nanopores. And so as a result, transport through them is slow. And so what you also need is distribution channels. You need larger channels. And so you need this hierarchical structure. And again, you see this a lot in natural systems. It is well known in the design of catalysts that you need these small and large channels, but the question is, how should they be? And there has been enormous progress in the synthesis of new catalysts where you can control structure at multiple scales. This is thanks to advances in chemistry and in material science. So can we build on these advances in chemistry and material science, learn lessons from nature to design hierarchical porous catalysts that are more effective, right? So this is what we set out to do. And as I mentioned, if you look at trees and leaves, they have different architectures. And you look at very big tropical leaves, like the ones you see here, that is really clear. You have first this fractal architecture, large channels become smaller and smaller, but then the cells are very uniformly distributed. So, and this goes together, this transition from fractal to uniform with one from flow to diffusion. And the same happens in a poplar leaf when you look with a microscope and you see this picture on the right. Again, you go from flow to diffusion, from a more fractal to uniform structure. Now, we don't take this as a dogma. So we did a lot actually of simulations in porous catalysts to actually see if similarly to these leaves, you would get what is the optimal structure and would this be actually fractal or uniform or would be something else. And what we found is that when you want to optimize a porous catalyst pellet or particle of a certain size built out of small catalyst grains, which are nanoporous, there's an optimal porosity and there's an optimal pore diameter in between grains with an optimal size. And again, that's very similar to the fact that you have cells of an optimal size for particle function in biology. And you have in these leaves or in various tissues, you go from this fractal to a very uniform scale. So we found that the optimal structure is one where the grains all have the same size with an optimal diameter of channels in between. And this leads to a local so-called effectiveness factor. This means an efficiency of the catalyst at this microscopic level of each of these grains, which is optimized so that you can control your product distribution and maximize your yields. And you have very efficient, in this way, transport of molecules in and out. The distribution around that optimum is much as important. So from an engineering point of view, it's very useful because now you have a design principles, right? So we learn the lessons from nature, the structure of the leaves. It gives us ideas of investigating this. Then we use computation to actually prove this point, that you have this uniform structure, and then we can start implementing this. And so here you see one example from a few years back where we looked at the reduction of nitrogen oxide emissions. So nitrogen oxides are responsible for acid rain, they're responsible, they're greenhouse gas as well, and they're emitted from power plants. So you need these so-called monolithic catalytic reactors at the outside, so they are covered with a porous catalyst with nanopores, right, with very narrow pores, to convert nitrogen oxides into nitrogen, right, which is already in the air, and it does this through a catalyst. And what we found is by using the same catalyst that was used industrially, but just by controlling the porosity in this way I just described, with optimal grain size and optimal size in between, you can reduce the amount of catalyst that's needed by a factor of 2 and yet have a yield that's twice as high. So you can make these monoliths much shorter, much more compact, and you move the emissions from this blue line to the red line. So this means that the length you need of this monolith is much, much shorter than it would be if you, so it would be if it were not this optimized structure. Now, very recently, this was experimentally validated in collaboration with Professor Glaser's group in the University of Leipzig in Germany. And so they found that indeed the profile you would have of these reactants in these catalyst, hierarchical catalyst particles, they would be much flatter. So the molecules are much more easily going in and products moving out. And you have a 200% increase in catalytic activity. Now, this was very nice to me because clearly we had theoretically predicted this first, computationally, and then it was demonstrated experimentally later. So it's not just after the fact, right? And so this shows the power of this approach. Now, there are various ways of making hierarchical structures, like these hierarchical zeolites, as I said. And so the question you have of having what is the best structure is now something we can address, right? So, for example, this is one type of so-called zeolite. A zeolitic material is also a type of catalyst used a lot, for example, in refining industries and in environmental processes. And so depending on the additive you use, you can make all these different morphologies of hierarchical porous catalysts. And you can ask which one is the best. Well, this approach allows you to tell you which one. And so depending on modifiers, so don't worry too much about the abbreviations. These are different chemicals you can add, but you can just see the beauty also of these structures. So this is something else that I showed on the teaser picture, right? So you see this hierarchical structure, a bit cauliflower-like or a bit like a desert rose. So you have different geometries you can make, but now looking from the nano to the micro level, right? And so when we explored these different catalysts and we looked at how they can absorb, for example, normal heptane, which is a hydrocarbon, which you can have in refineries, whether they're traditional ones or you would have in biorefineries. And then you use a process called hydroisomerization. It's to make isoheptane. But what you don't want is over a catalyst. But what you don't want, and what could happen normally, is that if this process, this catalytic process goes too far, then you're going to make, you're going to crack this molecule. You're going to break it up in smaller components you don't want. And so what we saw is that with the, you see the pink curve here on the right, is that through a particular structure, the one that is here, the top one here, that is this more like cauliflower-like, you have a much quicker uptake of these molecules of normal heptane. And what you see in the curve, the picture in the bottom, is that as a function of temperature, you can make a lot more isomers than with any of these other products. Now, these are huge differences. You can go to a yield of the product you want of 80%, which is much higher than any other catalyst that is out there. Now note, we didn't change the structure of the catalyst at the nanoscale, but we changed it at mesoscopic scales. And this is real chemical engineering. This is not just material science, right? And so it governs the structure of these catalysts. It guides the synthesis of the catalyst. And what's happening at that cusp, you see the maximum in that curve is that when the temperature is very low, then the reactions are very sluggish, okay? They don't happen very quickly. You don't make many products. When the reaction is very high, then the temperature is very high, then the reactions are sped up. So they go very, very quickly. But the problem is that when they go too quickly, the molecules can't go in quickly enough and products removed. So you get into so-called diffusion limitations. And so you have this limitation of transport. And so that's why you go through this maximum. But this maximum can be shifted to higher temperatures, and the products of which you want to make are much higher in this optimized hierarchical structure inspired by nature, because the products move out before they are decomposed again by the catalyst in smaller fragments, okay? So this is a bit in a short way of how you can hierarchically structure these catalysts, right? So I'm kind of switching gears and just show you very quickly the work of Niall Kent, who's a former postdoc and now honorary lecturer in our center. And he's been working on dental materials. And so we use the same approach to look at dental bone graft substitute material for dental implants. If you lose a tooth, also you need some material to be able to screw a graft in there with the dental implant. This is, of course, a very painful process. It's a long process. And the material of bone, which is mostly hydroxyapatite, needs to be able to be grown so that it grows together with in your mouth, right? And so we designed and synthesized this new material that has this hierarchical structure, very similar to what I just explained in catalysis. And this material leads to much higher so-called osseointegration, integration with the bone, more than 80%, in fact. And this is much higher than any of the commercial materials that are out there. It does it much faster, and it is through this controlled delivery process and this transport process that is optimized. And so this has been patented, and we are now commercializing this. Now, I would like to note that Niall Kent, who's at the basis of this, I mean, he also now got his medical degree. He's a medical doctor as of last year, and he's now working as and on the front line during this crisis in ICU. So he's really combining his medical job with what he's doing here. So we have some remarkable people we work with in our center, which we're very proud of. So Niall also last year won the UCL Enterprise Innovation Early Career Award at UCL for our discovery on aerograph materials. And with UCL Business, we are now looking at licensing these materials. There's also involved at some stage a former PhD student, Silume Otto, who worked also on nature-inspired engineering, but applied to membranes, something I won't have time to discuss today. Again, it's just a taster, and won a Royal Academy of Engineering Enterprise Fellowship. So what I'd like to show is that you can draw some lessons from nature, apply them in one area, and then also use that same approach, for example, from catalysis and learning about transport phenomena, reaction engineering, which are things that are within the curriculum in chemical engineering as we teach it at UCL. But then, thanks to the team efforts we have and bringing people together with different backgrounds, for example, Niall, physical chemistry, dental materials backgrounds, bringing other people like Silo, who was doing her PhD on another subject, to bring this together and come with these innovations, right? And which can lead to breakthroughs. So we're using this for dental implant materials. Also, we have products that could be used for toothpaste, okay? So as a final example, I just want to show the example of fuel cells. So fuel cells are devices that are used for continuous transformation of chemical energy into electrical energy. And so the challenge that you have with a fuel cell is that the catalyst is very expensive. Often it's a noble metal. And there are also stability issues and transport issues. So often in PEM fuel cells, the fuel that is used is hydrogen. Okay, and so I think you will have more talks, other taster lectures that will talk about fuel cells and batteries as well. So here we'll see how we can learn again from nature to make these fuel cells more effective. So the hydrogen on one side, on the anode, needs to be split in protons and electrons. The protons need to migrate through membrane, assemble with oxygen from air, at the cathode, again a catalytic process, and form water. This seems so simple, just hydrogen and oxygen makes water. But the problem is that again, the catalyst is expensive, there are transport limitations, stability issues, and the water could condense and lead to water management issues. And so we learn lessons from the structure of not just trees, but also lungs, because lungs are very efficient at distributing air. And so in the top level of the lungs, it does it through fractal structure, but then at the bottom level, let me recapitulate here. So in an adult human lung, you would have 14 levels of branching, self-similar fractal branching. Okay, so 14 to 16 levels actually of branching. And then these channels become smaller and smaller into the bronchioles. And so if they become narrower, remember what I said earlier, then transport would be too slow. And so diffusion takes over. And this is where you have exchange with the bloodstream. The tissue is also different. It's not cartilage, but it's soft tissue where you have exchange with the bloodstream. And the structure is different. It changed from fractal to a very uniform structure. So that's amazing, isn't it? It's wonderful, I would say. So you have these same physical properties you see in nature in these different organisms, and they serve a particular process. We can never prove this, that this is why this is, but likely lungs have evolved for this reason because they need to be very efficient and effective, and they are key to life, right? You know, mammals. So you have the same structure in various mammalian lungs. And they're also thermodynamically extremely efficient, effective in this distribution. So in these alveolar structures, you have this exchange, as I said, with the bloodstream, and we learned from these principles of the fractal architecture at the top level to design new flow plates to distribute the air on one side and the hydrogen on the on side of the flow plate through a fractal structure. And then you have a catalyst, which is hierarchically structured using the same principles I discussed earlier. So I don't have much time to discuss this in detail, but I'll just show you again the same methodology, right? So we we actually did computational studies first on the distribution of flow, of how the air can be distributed to such a plate. What would be the optimal architecture? Learning again from nature. There's an optimal diameter to length ratio, which you see in the bronchi in the lung. And again, this is not accidental. This actually leads to minimum entropy production. This is because during breathing, when you breathe in and out, you want to lose a minimum of metabolic energy, the energy you get from food that you also need to walk around and to think. So a minimum of energy needs to be spent on just breathing. And so that is done thanks to an optimized length to diameter ratio at each level in the lung. And so we implemented that same principle in the design of these flow plates, and we simulated these things computationally, and we showed that the optimal number of branching generations. And so with X-ray microtomography, a technique we have in our labs, we can actually look through some of these flow plates we built out of steel. So you can look through metal, just like with an X-ray medicine, right? So you can look through this and you see this fractal architecture. And so with the different numbers of generations, when you have a higher number of generations, you see with a higher number of branching generations, you see a big ramp up of the current density you get out of this fuel cell. Because you have more better distribution of the air on one side, hydrogen on the other side, much more efficient reactions, much more uniformly distributed, right? So, and this becomes also more scalable. But what you also notice, if you were to change the number of generation and make it even higher, this would not improve things. At some moment it levels off. And again, this is like in the lung, because you, at some moment, a diffusion will set in and you cannot breach that limit. So there, it is more the structure of the catalyst that is important. So again, you don't imitate nature. We didn't copy just the lung. We used principles of the mechanism of the lungs and of trees to design these fuel cells. And so here you see kind of a picture which is generated by one of our PhD students, Marika Schmidt, who is also working on nature-inspired coatings and is an architect by training. So as you see, we have in the group people from various backgrounds working on projects. And so here you see the whole principle. So we go from nature, we derive a concept, this fractal architecture for distributing the side, hydrogen on the other side, then the hierarchical structure of the catalyst, which I won't discuss, but using similar principles to what I showed earlier. Then we build a design, first in plexiglass, and then we do just computational work, and then you experimentally realize this. And we obtain these results where you have much higher current densities, and also, which I didn't discuss, a much better, much less catalyst you need to lead to the same type of overall currents. Okay, so in this way you can transform fuel cell design by using this nature-inspired, lung-inspired approach. And again, this is a team effort. You see the names of former PhD students, postdocs in the group. Now, another PhD student, Sasank, he's using printed circuit boards now to actually realize the same principles. Because what was nice is that this worked well, but it is made through additive manufacturing, where through selective laser sintering of steel, we could make these fractal plates. So again, a few years ago, this was unimaginable, but thanks to the revolutions now in additive manufacturing and 3D printing, we can make it. Still, it's too expensive to do this out of steel. So here with Sasank, we can reduce the price by a factor of 10 by actually doing this through printed circuit boards. So you have these printed circuit boards you can stick together, and you can have a very similar structure that you can generate, again, with X-ray microtomography. You saw this picture again on the teaser picture at the beginning. And so similarly, we can make these fractal plates, and you see the nice architecture. And this is also a way to check whether there are any defects in the structure to generate this, right? So here, this illustrated in a very recent review paper we just published. It is just out, that you can download and look at if you're interested in this. This shows you actually the whole philosophy, right? So in nature-inspired chemical engineering, we learn from the nanoscale, through the mesoscale, through the macroscale about structures from nature, right? The structure of the lungs or leaves, structure of enzymes. I didn't quite talk about this. And we redesign catalysts, redesign different structures, flow plates, for fluid distribution, for reaction engineering, using computational tools, using experimental tools, and so learning these principles from nature and applying them in these design. All right. So I just will stop here because we're running out of time. And as I said, this is just a teaser. We have all these other mechanisms I showed you earlier that allow you to learn from non-equilibrium situations, the dynamics, nano-confinement effects, where you can learn how to solve other challenging problems, from membranes processes to control delivery in drugs, to nature-inspired coatings, through so many other problems, challenging problems we have. But I hope this gave you a bit of a taster of what we do, both in research on nature-inspired chemical engineering at UCL. This is a unique program we have. We're very excited about how it requires thinking out of the box in collaboration, but also we teach this approach in these lectures, in this one-term lectures as an elective in the final year, and also for MSc students, and where you can practice this to solve a problem of your choice. So let me see with how I can stop the sharing here, and hope I can find my cursor back. Don't seem to. Here we go. Stop share. And so I just want to see if there's any questions people have. So feel free to put things in Q&A if you're interested, or you want to see other examples. So I can just read it. I can't hear you, but I can read the examples in the Q&A or in the chat. Okay, I see many questions now coming in. When it rains, it pours, as they say, isn't it? So to make some slides available, you have an ability to actually some of my presentations also on YouTube. They're always different because I always like to explain things in different ways. Also, when I teach and give my lectures, I like to illustrate things in different ways. I can certainly send some slides. We can look with Marc Bernardis, who's helped us organize this, to how we can share some of these. The membranes examples. I mean, they may not be covered in upcoming weeks because we have many exciting examples, which are not necessarily with nature-inspired chemical engineering, although some of the people who present also collaborate with us. So I got a question here about, do you take part in the nature-inspired chemical engineering after you graduate from the course? So what I've noticed is that many of our students who take this course, they feel, it equips, I would say, the students, that's also the feedback I get, with different eyes, a different methodology to innovate, to think out of the box. I mean, it's quite typical, I would say, that it's not just, you get a course on catalysis, reaction gene, these subjects are all very interesting, but also how do you think differently? Because it's easy enough to say, think out of the box, do something different, do something transformative. But this is a methodology of how to do it. And so some of the students, they choose to do, who I say undergraduates, to choose to do a PhD. Some of the MSCs have gone on to do a PhD project. Other of our graduates implement this in their jobs. I mean, they take this approach with them in the companies where they work. We have, that's of course on a different level, we have our PhD students and postdocs, and quite a few have gone also to academic jobs elsewhere and take some of this approach with them. But it's specifically, I mean, students can of course stay in touch with us. And we also now have a network, so-called knowledge transfer network in the UK, which brings also people together. So we work a lot with industry. I didn't quite mention this, but we have dozens of industrial partners. And some of the research we do is in collaboration with industrial partners, while some of the other, some project may be sponsored by them. We also have the Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering has a very active advisory board. And so also with industrial and academic members. And so, so we work on really also very practical problems. And it also brings people who work with us in contact with them. And so some of our students may work in these companies later as well. Here's another question here. This is a good question as well. So it says, well, there's a linear process taking inspiration from nature, working your way to design. Does it sometimes not work? Sure, it could be that it doesn't work, but the reason why it wouldn't work, the only ways we found is because perhaps the tools are not mature yet. All right, so this is what I had with a fractal injector for fluidized beds. At that time, the structure was too, I mean, it was too much in advance of its time, if you wish. So now we have this additive manufacturing. And so in this way, you can bring things forward, which can be used for, say, reaction engineering. Synthesis materials become also more economical to control things from the nano to the macro scale. So as manufacturing tools, as computational methods, and so forth, become more available, this becomes much more practical. And this is also, I think, why many of our industrial partners are interested in this work. So, so there are moments also where we shouldn't just be blinded and only think, well, because it exists in nature, it's better. This is why it's important to think about the mechanism behind it and the principle you want to learn from nature. And I guess this is why the approach has been quite successful, although it doesn't mean that the implementation is overnight in every case, right? So other examples, well, there are quite a few that go from catalysis to membranes, to fuel cells, to, I mean, you can apply it in batteries, obviously, but also, say, in immunotherapy, right? So there's examples where we use process intensification cancer immunotherapy in collaboration with colleagues in medicine. So we had one student develop a microfluidic chip with controlled materials, using the knowledge that cells behave differently in different environments. For example, some cells can become cancerous or not, or cells, adoptive T cells, T cells need to be activated to boost the immune system for people with cancer. So how can you use the principles of our immune system to actually conquer disease, right? This may be really interesting also in our times, but I do not want to jump ahead of myself here. But this has been used also for developing a platform for cancer immunotherapy. So new materials in a microfluidic platform to make adoptive T cells at a fraction of the cost. So some of the questions, if you don't get an answer, feel free to also email me, right? You can find my information contacts online. And what I will put up here is one slide, if I can. Let me see if I can do that. As I say, I'm not hopefully, I'm not sure if I can do that still. All right. I'm not sure if I hope you see this. So this is actually a page where you can get more information on our websites, on the CNIE. Even if you type in nature-inspired chemical engineering or nature-inspired engineering, you'll find this. And there's a brochure you can download. And this contains many examples. It contains also more work from many of our talented students. It says something about the course as well. It has much on our various applications. And so if there anything that captures your interest, feel free to get in touch with me, right? So there was a question about commercialization of something. So as you see that some of the work we do it purely scientific with support from EPSRC. We do things in collaboration with industries, or there is some entrepreneurship. And so in this entrepreneurship, there are people who may want to carry it on, and where we work with UCL business. So UCL has an arm, UCL business, that can help to progress work from the labs to practice, to be taken up, say, to be, for example, patents that can be licensed, or to for industrial applications. So let me stop my share here. So I see that many people are still online, so I'm very happy to answer other questions. So there was a question about, to apply the mechanism of nature in a process, is it possible that the mechanism shown on the macroscopic scale in nature be applied in a process that is microscopic? It's a good question, but that allows me to actually kind of stress one point, which is that we don't copy immediately in nature. So for example, if we, let's say the lung structure, as I just illustrated, allows for very scalable, uniform distribution of the air. So if we were going to make a microscopic lung, well, it will not function because the fluid dynamics, the hydrodynamics are very, very different, right? We can't just scale everything down in the same way, because the physics of transport and of many phenomena, they are very much tied to scale, right? So in some cases, it may work at a smaller scale as long as the principle is preserved. So copying something from a larger scale to a smaller scale, well, only if the same mechanistic principles that you would like to utilize from nature can be utilized to your application. If it's just copying it, but just changing the length scales, then it's not going to typically work. But what you can do is, if you were to say the size of a lung, for example, from a mouse to an elephant, the structure is very similar, but the number of levels in the hierarchy of branching is very different. And so one can use, and the one of the human is somewhere in between. And so again, for our, as I showed in the example of the fluidized bed, but also for the fuel cell, yes, it is microscopic. It's much smaller, say, than the human. In a fuel cell, it would be smaller than, say, the human lung. But for the fluidized bed example with the fractal three-dimensional distributor, well, the scale will depend on the size of the reactor, but you change the number of generations. So the small scale, though, you will keep constant. It is just the large scale that becomes larger, right? And it's just this hierarchy and the fractal scaling concept that we use from nature. Okay, so I hope this kind of explains this. What I did not show, because I just didn't have the time, and again, there would be just too many examples, would be that at the nanoscale, there's so much to learn, right? So in terms of membranes, there are things to learn in terms of, for example, these aquaporins, which are protein channels in cell membranes. They help to channel water through a cell, but not between the outside and the inside of a cell, but not the protons and not the salts. So it's fantastic for water desalination. So can we learn from this principle? The answer is yes. So we can design new ones, but instead of just using the aquaporins, which by the way is one approach that is used. So there are people making artificial membranes, integrating these biological proteins in some other matrix. That is biointegration, right? It is one approach. We choose to make new materials. Say they can be based on an inorganic material or a polymer, an artificial one, but with pores and functions of these pores, chemical groups that also generate electrostatic interactions and interactions with, say, the molecules you want to filter out or the molecules you want to go through, which are similar to the biological membranes. So it's using against the principle, but then at the nanoscale. And often it turns out, why does it work in the aquaporin, say? It is a balancing of forces between nano confinement, very narrow channels, and the interactions of the some charged amino acids in the center of this channel with to repel actually cations. So the cations cannot move through these channels. And this way the anions also don't because of electroneutrality, right? So this is an example for nature-inspired membranes so that we use in design. And there's some exciting work in the group also in anti-fouling that we use to learn from how in the kidney, for example, you have fouling. The kidney must last a lifetime. It filters all the water, but the protein should be preserved. So can we learn of how this happens without clogging the membrane? And so we're learning some principles, and this is the work of one of our PhD students, Halan Mohammed, is working on this, and two postdocs in the group, Yanan Liu, who are working on this. So there was a question here, if the approach is unique to UCL chemical engineering, are we partnering with other institutions? And are other institutions offering a similar course? Well, the approach was, I started this approach many years ago. I started nature-inspired chemical engineering more than 20 years ago, developed it further at UCL with the opportunity to build a Center for Nature-Inspired Engineering with funding from EPSRC, so it is our National Science Foundation. And then we have many, as I said, industrial contacts and collaborations. And so this methodology is being gradually developed and is more applied to a variety of problems. Now, we collaborate in a number of these problems also with external partners. So these are not just industry, but also academic partners. I showed some examples actually in my lecture where I put down names. I always like to put different people we collaborate with from different universities and different places around the world. And they're literally around the globe. So we work very internationally. We also have many visitors coming internationally. And so, but the approach itself is now more and more also starting to become adopted by researchers in other places, whether it's in industry or in academia, elsewhere. The mechanistic approach is unique to what we have developed in the center. So this nature-inspired solutions for engineering approach is something but we have published quite widely on this, and so more and more people, as I said, are using it. I've also been contacted. Some people might be interested in developing also courses on this. We're also thinking, actually developing a new MSc program around nature-inspired engineering, but that's not yet for next year. So the course is offered, but not yet a whole program on this. There was a question about dunes. And to give an example of this, let me see if I can get to this example of the dunes to share it with you. So I admit that I'm not so, I'm trying to get this right. Yep. Okay, I hope this is shared. So I alluded to the fact that you have this pattern formation on dunes, on beaches, but the same ones on altocumulus clouds. You even see them on a cup of green tea when you vibrate it, or right? And so the thing is that perturbations, whether it's through vibrations or through the action of the wind or through the waves, these gusts and the waves that come in and out, they change a system that is chaotic and very complex, granular flow is very complex, to one that becomes very regular. So you get these very regular patterns that are forming. And so this is something we can learn from. So you have these very regular structures. And so what we learn from is the fact that instead of operating things continuously, why don't we operate our reactors by also pulsating the flow? Now, that by itself, people have worked with changing flow rates, but if we use the same principles and the way in which this works in these granular systems and in these fluid systems in a reactor, learn from the mechanisms, maybe we can make this work. And so I'll get back to the example of the fluidized bed, since there was a question on that. And so you can see here, hopefully, that when you, instead of continuously having this gas coming through the bottom plate, now there's no fractal structure in there, okay, just for clarity, but now we oscillate the gas flow at a frequency that can change between, say, 2 Hertz to 7 Hertz. We just can vary it. We get these very regular bubble patterns. So you see these triangular patterns that are neatly rhyming. So you have a structuring of your system by oscillating it. Very similar to these ripples you see in the sand. So you see this setup, right? And you can do this in 2D. You can do it in a 3D reactor. Like, these are examples from setups in our laboratory, and you can see them in our lab, and so we use them in our research. And you see in a 3D bed, when you look from the top, you see these very beautiful square patterns that also alter. This is done with a high-speed camera. So this bed is pulsed with a gas flow that is a couple of Hertz, so a couple of cycles per second. And so you see that you get these very regular patterns. Now, what you also see that these are not classical linear waves, just like the waves you have when when you strike a chord, or when you have on a violin, for example. When you, and these are not classical standing waves. You see that you get a square pattern in a cylindrical system. And so this is very similar to what you have with these regular patterns you see in the, that you can see when you vibrate particles on a plate, or you have them on these dunes, right? So thanks to oscillations, what you have is you have energy inputs. The particles are shaken up, they interact with the fluid around it, and you get this dissipation as a result. You get energy dissipation through drag and through interactions between the particles. And so the system changes between one that is dominated by friction between particles to one that's dominated by drag in each cycle. And so you can structure the system. And so we can use this also to improve distribution, fluidized bed, to scale them up, and even to understand multiphase flow better, right? So this is another example. So thanks for asking. So as I said, I have many examples. There's only so much time. As I said, I will be happy to share more examples. You can see some online as well in the research. So let me go up here. There was some requested about gas absorption and adsorption. Yeah, I think definitely. So this is similar to what the example I showed with the liquid-liquid mixing and this fractal structure that we're building. You could do this with a gas being absorbed in a liquid, very similar, or a gas adsorbed by particles, right? So very similar examples, right? So, so that actually illustrates the fact that once you validate it in one case, it doesn't mean again you should just copy it to another one. The optimal fractal architecture, the size of these channels and how they are organized will be different if you want to absorb gas in a liquid or absorb a gas on a solid or mix liquids. You can imagine if you want to mix two liquids and they are very easily mixed, say, okay, so you can put this injector in there and maybe just with one generation, poof, it just mixes, right? It moves around, it mixes. But if it's very very right, and it doesn't flow easily, and you have one fluid that flows easily, otherwise it would clog the tubes, that goes through this injector, and it flows out and mixes locally, then you probably want a lot of generations, right? So to be able to access the more viscous fluids that moves around. So again, we need to learn from hydrodynamics. And again, that's chemical engineering, right? So studying fluid mechanics, these are the courses we teach in the regular engineering curriculum. So, so this is more approach of combining that and using these insights. We can, there's a question about studying honeycombs. Clearly there's a lot to learn from honeycombs, and clearly learning by the mechanism, first of all, of how they are formed. What can we learn by the self-organization you have? Because the way that the honeycomb forms is self-organization of all these bees working individually, yes, together. The collection is more than the individual. It's fascinating, isn't it? And so there's some things to be learned from this. We're not necessarily working on this. A lot of people are working actually on nature-inspired robotics and so forth. So they're isolated fields. So nature-inspired engineering is becoming very popular around the world. There's a lot of people that use examples from nature. But what is unique, perhaps, or I would say, is the way we combine all this, and we have this mechanistic approach, right? So it's not just in robotics or in architecture or in chemical engineering. It is using these principles and translate from one example to another. Yes, so we are always open to establish collaborations. There were questions about this. I think there's even questions about grading here, which is interesting already. So we are, you know, we are actually proud of our students. I mean, I think students work very hard, and this is not, we are not masking it to say that this is just an easy course. It isn't. But then people who get a degree, they've earned it. And so we are I'm always quite excited to see how students grow. And so how students grow through this. And grading is one way of evaluating students. And so, for example, in this course in nature-inspired chemical engineering, we have different milestones in the project. We don't just say at the beginning, go to nature, find an example, use the principles we say, and just develop it in your team. No, we have different milestones throughout. There are actually 4 throughout the course. and you get feedback, and there's a partial grade for that, and so forth. And so that's how it works throughout the course, right? So this is one example in which I apply it, and there are many ways of trying to distribute between grading of assignments throughout and at the end. And it's always a bit subtle because terms are short. So how much can you do in an exam, and how much through assessments throughout? And we encourage, of course, students to extra work they want to submit, and to get feedback and interact with us. I mean, that's the nice thing. I enjoy interacting actually with the students, and so do my colleagues. I'm happy to, I see that there's still quite a few participants. There's still 70, so I'm happy to continue for a bit. I see about questions about water treatment. We are actually working on an example related to water treatment. So I have one postdoctoral fellow at this moment in the group, and also PhD students. So I mentioned the example of learning from kidneys and from biological structures in terms of anti-fouling. So in water treatment, one thing is to go from dirty water to clean water. I discussed water desalination briefly, but also to purify water. But another one is, how can you avoid the fouling of these membranes, so that dirt accumulates and then it blocks. And so this can be, sometimes you can regenerate, sometimes you can't, right? And so the fact that in the kidney, for example, and in other structures in our body, these must be able to survive many, many cycles of separations. So this, we can learn lessons both from the chemical structure. For example, in cell membranes, and then you see this also in the kidney, there are some sugar molecules that are actually coating the membrane. And so you get so-called glycocalyx groups. And so we can then see what are the reasons for the fact that these help to repel foulants, right? So, and then we have different hypotheses. So is it due to specific chemical groups? Is it due to particular spacing? Because these membranes, of course, have holes, they have pores, but then you notice the pores are actually much larger than some of the foulants, which don't go through. So it's not just based on size. It's not just size separation. Maybe it's charge, right? And so we do then experiments that go back to basics, synthesize artificial membranes or use artificial membranes, which we then functionalize to look at the effect of chemical groups, of electrostatic interactions, of hydrophilic versus hydrophobic groups, right? So that means loving water or hating water, repelling molecules. And this gives us new insights. And then we can go back to nature and say, oh, this might be the principle used there. And we learn these lessons and implement this for anti-fouling in our in artificial membranes. So there's quite a bit of research we do on this at present. Other great question here, asking about the sequence of nature's bad chemical engineering research. Do we first know, the question was, do you first know of a design challenge and then look into nature to apply it, or is it analyzing nature to think of its applications? It's a bit of both, actually. So I'm a chemical engineer, right? And you're interested clearly in chemical engineering. So I'm seeing challenges. That's how I started off my lecture. Really, some are really grand challenges, so they go beyond purely chemical engineering. And then we say, how can we address this? Are there clues? What is the defining problem here? So sometimes it's a problem of scalability, say, right? Sometimes it's a problem of efficiency or thermodynamic efficiency even, of improper use of resources. How is nature so effective in its resources? How are different cycles combined? How can we learn from a rainforest of how different plants work together, right? So what can we learn from nature and derive these principles to solve a particular issue we have, right? So whether it is scalability, efficiency, robustness, and so forth. So that is one way, right? So another one is we have analyzed some principles in nature, like for example, I look at all these vegetables, or I look at search, and you say, there's a similar structure here. Is this coincidence? So this is asking a question, right? And then you have a hypothesis. And Sometimes it could be that some structures are coincidence. I mean, there's a huge diversity of structures of plants, and maybe there's no particular reason they have evolved in this way, and they're continuing to evolve. But sometimes there are very specific reasons in terms of particular purposes for nature, right? In terms of survival, for example. Or this is the key element, like the lung is very interesting because it's so key to us. And that gives you clues, right? So this gives you clues of saying, well, maybe I can learn some lessons from this because these are also challenges we have in engineering. And so then it is finding these universal principles is again looking at nature. So it goes back and forth, right? So sometimes it's examples from nature that help us drive some problems, solutions to problems in engineering. And oftentimes it meets it in the middle. It is that we have problems in engineering and we want to find a solution. We say, hey, nature got some clues there. But remember, we need to think about the context of the solution. So nature, even though it's evolved, and natural structures evolve, it doesn't mean they're always optimal for us, right? They may have different purposes. And so nature also has different materials. For example, it may not say always be bad to use steel, or maybe it may be not bad to use some materials, composites that we can make and don't exist in nature. You don't necessarily need to use just natural materials. And so nature may not have that at its disposal. And depending on where a plant grows, the environment is completely different. So we have more tools. On the other hand, nature often needs to find solutions where the timescales are different, right? So, for example, a tree can grow over hundreds of years, while we want to build our scalable injector and distributor. And so we're going to have to grow it in probably different ways. And there's an interesting program one of our PhD students is working on, together with a colleague, Professor Marcos Cruz in the Bartlett in our architecture school, learning from biomineralization. So how are minerals growing in nature? Very interestingly, and in different structures, different patterns, but it appears very, very slowly, and it can be templated by proteins, and they can grow even, you would like to replace concrete because it's so energy consuming and so polluting, but can we do this in nature? Yeah, nature has solutions to actually make very strong materials that could be used as building material, but it's extremely slow. So how can we speed this up? So just copying nature directly is not going to work. So we need to draw some lessons from how this biomineralization, biotemplating works, and then perhaps see ways to accelerate this or to apply this and implement this in a context. And that's what I also find so exciting, and what is actually very special, I feel, particularly UCL. I have worked in different places, but the interaction with people in various departments is very easy. And so by working and having this student, so her name is Nina Jotanovic. So she's in architecture, but also co-guided by me in chemical engineering. So there, we also look at new ways of generating these materials, and whether you can speed up this process, or whether you can use it not just for bulk building materials, but for coatings, right, like veneers, right? And so this is quite an interesting application, right? So can you use this technique to current catalytic converters, or is it already implemented to a nanoscale? Well, the example I showed on the hierarchical catalysts could actually be used for catalytic converters, but one has to see which type of converter, right? So there needs to be also an economic reason, or it needs to be a question. So sometimes something actually works and it is cheap enough, and so there may be less of a reason why people would look for this transformative approach to implement it. Now, when the example I gave on the selective catalytic reduction for NOx, I think would be really interesting. And now that we have recently, with this collaboration in Germany, experimentally validated this in these materials, maybe this is something to again look at and to see how can this be implemented, how can it be used in the form of a catalytic converter to, say, remove NOx. Now, I should say that the translation from things that are happening at the lab scale and going all the way to industry and the macroscopic scales, it's not an easy path, right? So you can do things in the lab in an academic environment. We work with industrial partners, as I said, or you can work to entrepreneurial routes, but often it is still a number of years before you see things in the field. Because there's so many things. We see this with our dental materials. So we need to think not just about the mechanisms, the material, we can make it more cheaply, which is the case. We can make it at larger quantities, exciting. So how can it really be deployed, right? How can it be done on a larger scale? Is it in a form that is also accessible to the particular using industry or a consumer, say, right? Okay, so those are the questions you need to ask. So chemical engineering and process design and product design need to think about the user as well, right? Which may be another business or maybe consumers. And so it can't work in isolation. And so this is a good, you know, so this kind of alludes also to some other questions I've been seeing. So some of my former, say, students have been very, say, entrepreneurial and using some of these principles as well. As I said, I mean, there was a question about, are there successful startups founded on the basis of nature-inspired chemical engineering? We've taken an avenue where at this moment we've been collaborating with a number of companies and where some of these principles can be utilized. And in other cases, we have at this moment followed a process of, as I said, licensing now of patenting and working on this. But I would see that more and more will now happen in the case of startup opportunities with where we stand now. This is really an exciting time in this regard. Maybe one example I still want to share with you, because I think it's quite exciting one, is one by another student who's originally an architect. I mentioned her, Malika Schmidt. So she's working and doing a PhD in chemical engineering with me, and also co-advised by Marcus Cruz in Bartlett. And so there we are making some coating materials, so nature-inspired coatings. And these materials are materials that are using, again, some principles from nature, in particular, the fact that you have structures where capillary flow is actually dominating water transport. So the question that we had is, can we make some coatings that can combine a variety of properties for controlling, say, humidity in a living environment, or that can focus light, for example. And I will kind of see if I have an example here that I can actually share with you. So get back to this. So kind of, can I share this screen here? So this gives you an image of this work. So this is Malika. So we learn, for example, on the wings of certain insects like cicada wings, they have these pillared structures on them on a microscopic scale. And so water can flow off these wings, and bacteria also don't attach to them. And this is due to these pillared structures. It's very specific pillaring. But then what's also interesting is in moth eyes and human eyes have cone-like structures, which are also pillared. And so in one case, it helps to absorb light so they can see in very dark environments, or we can focus light. And so we've used this, and we make this through nano printing. So we have this special instrument where we can print the structures you see here on the right, which is done by a photopolymerization, photoinitiated polymerization. You see this very beautiful architecture, they're bottle-shaped structures, and the whole structure is only a few millimeters wide. So this is really with a nano printer. And so in this way, you can actually have water that is collected. So you see the interaction with light, it can focus light, but it can also, so it can focus this light very brightly as well, but also water droplets will attach to this and then can be channeled through. And so this is quite interesting. I mean, generates beautiful images as well. So this was actually exhibited in a famous museum in Paris, in the Centre Pompidou as well. So you see the interaction with the arts even, huh? It caught the interest of the European Space Agency because these structures could be used as coating materials, perhaps for the International Space Station. So where there's a problem where if you want to bring water to space for space missions, future space missions, whether it's to the space station itself or to bases, it costs maybe $50 to $100 million a year to bring water to space. Okay, so I forgot the exact number of it, but it's more than $50 million a year to actually bring water to the space station. So this is extremely expensive. because some of the water is not recycled. It cannot be regenerated. And so these materials, if you were to use them on ventilation shaft and capture some of that water, condense it through this and recycle, with in addition having the advantages that this, because it's polymeric, could stop some of the radiation, which is another very big challenge. And so it has these multifunctional properties of being antibacterial, channeling water, interacting with light in interesting ways. So these are very exciting materials. So it shows how this is perhaps not a startup, but it is actually working in a completely different area, how this has channeled from using it first on Earth, where this would be at this moment too expensive to make on a large scale, but where you can use it for an application where it's really needed and where, you know, it's almost at any cost. If you can actually channel through more water, if you can recycle more water, keep the environment clean, like in the space station, it would be a question of life and death. So this will be very interesting. And by testing it in such an environment, so this is something we're working on. This is very, very much now. We're on a pathway of testing these materials, hoping to have parabolic flights where we can test them, and perhaps on a pathway, if successful, for the space station. And so this will be something then, when this is successful, it may help a similar type of issues on Earth. You know, heat pipes, fuel cells, and so forth, they have really been tested and used in new composite materials for applications that were, say, in space technology and Formula One, before they came to general consumer products. So this is another avenue that we are taking. So I was kind of wanting to show you that example as well. Yeah, so I think I will see, perhaps we will, so these are coatings, right? It makes coatings to be used as self-cleaning membranes for anti-fouling. So these are just an example that I just gave you. So you see how people work on water, in membranes, in fuel cells. There's also an issue of the water channeling, which I won't discuss today now, but which also use capillary forces, learning from nature, learning from desert animals. So I hope, I mean, I think I will stop here, but please, if there are other questions that you feel have not been answered or things you want to hear about, feel free to drop me a message. I've given you already my coordinates, and you can find them online, of course. And it's really been my pleasure to share some of my passion with you on nature-inspired chemical engineering, on the research, the fantastic group that is doing this work as well in our labs, the collaborations we have at UCL. And I hope to see many of you in practice, and then perhaps join the nature-inspired chemical engineering class as well in a few years. So I wish you all a happy day. I hope we get out of these very challenging times very soon, so we can have lectures like this also in person and see each other, which I always enjoy, of course, more. But thanks to the technology we have, at least we could share some ideas, and I'm very happy to do this. So I wish you all the very best, and I wish you a lot good health as well in these difficult times. Thank you.